Why would a trained soldier, staring down a perfectly good Browning machine gun at an enemy fighter, miss almost every single time? It sounds insane. Men drilled for months, weapons designed to shred metal, yet tracers streak past empty sky. Planes dance through the air like ghosts. Bullets arrived late. Courage didn't help. Training didn't fix it. The truth is stranger and colder than panic or poor aim. It's a problem of timing, perception, and something almost nobody in the heat of battle could feel. Where the target would be, not where it was. Stick around. This one counterintuitive failure changed aerial combat forever. December 1942. The sky over the Solomon Islands is a bruise of smoke and sun, bright and dangerous all at once. Inside a lumbering B-17, 19-year-old gunner Eddie Kowalski squints into the glare, breath shallow, hands steady on the gun mount. He's too young to be here, too practiced to feel safe. He scans the blue like a man waiting for something that could end everything. A metallic glint catches his eye. A Japanese Zero screams into view, engine a high-pitched howl, wings flashing like a hornet bent on destruction. Eddie's world shrinks to that single streak of metal and sky. His grip tightens on the gun, breath caught, heart hammering. There's no time for thought, only the raw, brutal calculus of a life-or-death duel. He tracks the Zero like a man who's rehearsed the motion 1,000 times, eyes narrowing, shoulder braced, fingers wrapped around the cold steel of a Browning M2. Every micro-adjustment is practiced muscle memory. The plane slides into his sights, a single glittering shape on endless blue. The world narrows to that one target. Eddie squeezes the trigger. A staccato roar answers him, and a stream of red tracers lances into the sky, bright, furious, a beautiful, deadly line arcing toward the Zero. Spent brass clatters. The gun jerks in his hands. For a breath, he tastes smoke and adrenaline. Every shot feels right, exact, inevitable. Until the plane keeps coming, untouched. But the red tracers find nothing. They draw a beautiful arc that dies in empty air. The Zero slices clean through his sightline, untouched. Eddie watches it vanish, his rounds thudding uselessly behind, falling like confetti. For a second he can't believe it. He squeezes again, the gun recoils, and the plane is already gone. He's brave. He's been trained. His Browning is one of the best weapons in the world. And yet his tracers stitch the sky and find nothing. Beautiful ribbons of fire arcing uselessly behind a plane that slides past, untouched. This isn't a story of cowardice or bad steel. It's a quieter betrayal. In the scream and smoke of combat, instincts that usually save you turn into the thing that kills you. Under the stress, under the thunder of engines and the flash of flak, the brain wants to aim at the obvious shape, at the plane, when the truth is harsher and far less intuitive. Eddie's failure isn't some private shame. It's the terrifying norm for Allied bomber crews. It isn't one bad shooter or a faulty Browning. It's a pattern baked into the way these missions are fought. Thin defensive arcs, blinding weather, split-second decisions against aircraft that are faster than the human eye can comfortably lead. Men trained in classrooms and on towed targets find themselves staring at tracers that pass harmlessly beneath enemy wings. Planes once seen as symbols of protection become open coffins. Losses stack up. Morale frays, and what looks like bad luck is, in fact, the shape of a systemic, deadly problem. Eddie's miss isn't an isolated failure. It's the pulse of a much larger calamity. Look up, and the sky isn't blue. It's a butcher's map of smoke, tracer lines, and shredded metal, where whole formations drift like wounded animals. Planes that climb out on Monday don't always make it home by Friday. Men who train together vanish between raids. What felt personal in the nose turret becomes a strategic hemorrhage. Tactics, training, and technology all strained to breaking. The image hardens. Europe's skies have turned into a graveyard for bombers, and Eddie's helplessness is suddenly everyone's problem. By 1943, the problem was no longer an abstract danger at the edge of a mission log. It was a catastrophe in cold numbers. The 8th Air Force was losing an average of 188 bombers every month, and with them went thousands of young men, whole crews vaporized in a handful of minutes. Replacement training couldn't keep pace, morale frayed, and each mission felt more and more like a roll of the dice. Air commanders faced the grim arithmetic. You could throw planes and steel at the enemy, but if your men kept disappearing, the campaign would grind to a halt, and answers had to come fast. Then the confirmation arrives. In 1943, the Army Air Forces publishes a study that turns rumor into reality. This is not bad luck or a few bad crews. It's a systemic collapse. What had been murmured in mess halls and seen in gun cameras is inked in cold, clinical pages, charts, hit rates, averages, showing the defenders simply can't hit what they need to hit. The language is blunt and the implication immediate. This is a quantified, undeniable crisis, and bravery alone won't fix it. Commanders can no longer chalk up losses to fate. They now face a clear, measurable problem that demands a solution. And the study's numbers were worse than anyone feared. Against crossing targets, the very way fighters attacked the bombers, the average gunner hit less than 4 times out of 100 rounds fired. Imagine lining up on a fast-moving plane and statistically being wrong 96 times. That isn't a minor deficiency. It's systemic failure spelled out in cold, immutable percentages. Training, courage, even the best guns couldn't erase that gap alone. The calculus of survival had flipped. The math said the odds were stacked against the bomber crew, and those grim digits made the crisis both undeniable and urgent. The study didn't just spit out a scary percentage, it turned the numbers into a moment you can feel. In a 10-second pass, a gunner pouring 130 rounds into the sky would, on average, score about 5 hits. 5. Not 5 that guarantee a kill. 5 strikes against a nimble, armored fighter that needs many more to be driven off. That tiny handful of impacts is a death sentence for bomber formations. It makes the cold 4% figure suddenly visceral. This isn't bad aim or cowardice. It's a physics problem wrapped in panic, and it's shredding crews long before strategy even has a chance. They were not losing to skill or luck, and not because the men weren't brave. They were losing to something colder and more implacable: physics. No enemy pilot, no clever tactic, just the brutal facts of speed, distance, and time. Bullets take time to travel, planes keep moving, and human instinct wants to point the gun at the visible threat instead of the empty space it will occupy a second from now. Courage couldn't change those equations. Training could, but only if it taught crews to outthink an instinct rooted in thousands of years of close-range fighting. To see how that works, imagine throwing a football to a running friend. Think of throwing a football to a running friend. You don't lob the ball where he is, you throw it where he'll be, into the space he'll run through, so the ball and the runner arrive together. That simple move, predicting future position instead of aiming at the present, is called deflection. In the air war, it's the same idea, only the math gets savage. Bullets take time to reach their path. Fighters cover hundreds of feet in that second, and aim at the plane's nose means every shot lands in empty sky. The problem isn't courage or trigger pull, it's learning to aim at a moment you can't yet see. Imagine throwing a football to a friend running downfield. You don't throw it at his chest, you throw it where he'll be a second from now. That's the whole trick, predicting motion and aiming at the future, not the present. In aerial gunnery, this idea is called deflection, or leading the target. It's the mental shortcut that converts a changing, three-dimensional problem, speed, distance, angle, into a single act, place your shot into the empty air the enemy will cross. Simple in words, brutally hard under fire. Without mastering it, bullets always arrive late. Now scale that up. Your friend is no longer an easy target on the lawn. He's a fighter plane streaking along at 400 miles an hour, a blur of metal and contrails. Your football becomes a .50 caliber bullet that, even at muzzle speeds, spends a full second or more arcing toward where the plane will be. In that time, the plane has moved hundreds of feet, far farther than any eye or instinct can easily predict. What felt obvious in the park, aim at the moving man, turns into a catastrophe in the sky. Point where the plane is, and your shot will arrive nowhere near it. Put simply, the lead you need isn't inches or yards, it's hundreds of feet. A fighter screaming across your field of view at several hundred miles an hour will move a football field's worth of distance in the time your .50 caliber bullet arcs out there. So you have to aim not where the plane is, but where it will be. And that where isn't a fixed dot you can hold. It shifts every fraction of a second with the enemy's speed, your range to him, the angle he's crossing at, your own motion, even wind and bullet drop. It's a moving math problem you have to solve in the middle of terror. Then, the terrifying truth dawns. The most natural thing in the world, pointing your gun at the enemy, was literally a guarantee of failure. A fighter screaming across the sky at hundreds of miles an hour outruns your bullet's travel time. By the moment that slug crosses the Zero's path, the plane is already gone. Your tracers streak beautifully into a patch of empty blue, and the enemy slips through untouched. Training could teach the math, but in the terror of combat, math doesn't help. Time, distance, and motion do. What felt right with your eyes was, in fact, the worst possible aim. Yes, the Army knew the math. They taught deflection in classrooms, ran gunnery simulators, and dragged realistic targets behind planes and boats so trainees could practice leading a crossing fighter until it felt natural. On a calm range, in daylight, with radios clear and instructors shouting corrections, it worked. But combat isn't a range. There's smoke and shrapnel, alarms screaming, a turret full of cold sweat and flashing lights, and a buddy bleeding on the floor. Under that pressure, theory peels away like wallpaper. Training becomes abstract. Instinct takes over. What's learned on the ground often dissolves the moment the sky becomes a battlefield. Shrapnel rips through the skin of the plane. Smoke stings. Radios chatter into static. In that white-hot second, the carefully taught rules, range, closure rate, deflection, bleed away. Not because the man failed to learn them, but because the body refuses to hold them under extreme stress. Fear narrows perception, time stretches and then collapses, and the brain returns to the simplest command it knows. Your hands close on the gun. Your eyes lock on the only solid thing in the sky, the enemy's fuselage. All the abstract math becomes useless, and the practiced response melts into a single reflexive motion. Instinct takes over. In the chaos, training peels away. Pain, wind, shrapnel, instinct takes the wheel. Your whole body screams the obvious. Point the gun at the threat. Aim at the plane. It feels right. And that reflex, as natural as breathing, is precisely what makes the bullets miss. Then comes the proof you can't argue with. Grainy, black and white gun camera reels from 1943 roll in slow, unforgiving detail. A fighter slides across the frame. Tracers stitch a bright line into the sky. And for a breath, the gunner's aim is exactly where it should be. Empty air ahead of the nose. No impact, no smoke. Panic flickers in his hands. The next frames are worse. Instinct snaps back, the sights snap onto metal, and every subsequent burst traces uselessly behind the plane. The footage is silent, clinical, and devastating. Training on a blackboard losing out to a single animal reaction. One gun camera reel nails it. A gunner tracks a Zero, gives the textbook lead, and opens up. bright tracers stitch a ribbon of fire into the empty sky where the math says the plane will be. But nothing connects. No sparks, no damage, just tracers swallowed by blue. For 2 long seconds he watches his bullets land nowhere, and the cruel truth hits him. He did everything right and still saw no reward. On those gun camera frames, you can see the moment training collapses into panic. He starts right, a correct lead, firing into empty sky, and there are no hits. In a split second, hope dies, and his brain rewrites the rulebook. Instinct screams, "Aim at the plane." He jerks the sight backward onto the fuselage. Every follow-up burst obeys that backward pull, tracers arcing uselessly past or punching harmlessly into metal behind the zero. The irony is brutal. Trying to fix the miss only guarantees more misses. In a handful of heartbeats, a chance to stop the attacker evaporates. Defense turned into invitation. This single cognitive flaw had catastrophic consequences. At Schweinfurt, Regensburg, the abstract mistake turned into a blood-soaked reality. Enemy fighters threaded through ragged arcs of tracer like ghosts. Bomber boxes peeled apart, and the sky filled with burning hulks and tangled parachutes. Men watched trained gunners pour belts of ammunition into empty air, while attackers picked off the crippled and hesitant. Whole squadrons limped home, missing half their crews or never came back at all. Commanders realized this wasn't a problem of hardware or courage, but of perception under fire. A failure of the human mind whose bill was paid in planes, lives, and strategic shock. Then came the stark, ugly number that turned theory into slaughter. On that one raid over Germany, more than 1 in 5 of the attacking bombers simply never came home. Over 20% lost in a single day. Planes went down under blue skies, crews cut to pieces or forced to bail into enemy territory. Formations that should have been a wall of fire instead opened like a zipper as fighters slipped through. It wasn't bad luck or bad machines. It was the lethal arithmetic of missed shots and sliced defenses. Proof that the crisis wasn't just tactical, it was psychological, and thus far deeper than anyone wanted to admit. The urgent question is no longer about better guns or braver men. It's about something quieter and far more dangerous, the human mind. Under the blast and thunder of an attack, training shatters and instinct takes over, and that instinct is wrong. So the problem isn't ballistics or metallurgy, it's biology and habit. Can you unlearn a lifetime of aiming at what your eyes demand and instead train a soldier to aim at empty air? Can you turn a deadly math problem into a reflex under terror? That's the new battle line, not in factories, but inside the skull, and it will force commanders to look for answers they never thought to seek. Desperate for an answer, military commanders stop guessing and start hunting. Late nights in bone-cold offices, clerks riffling through dented filing cabinets, officers hunched over stacks of yellowed reports and faded graphs, following any lead no matter how small. They comb through decades of tests, memos, and marginalia, pulling dusty boxes and flipping brittle pages, hoping against hope that somewhere in the archives a missed clue will explain how to stop the sky from eating their men. They dug through musty boxes and forgotten files, the kind of paperwork wars leave behind, and then they found what felt like a ghost, a brittle, typewritten technical paper dated 1924, authored by a British lieutenant colonel named James Puckle. The cover was unassuming. The pages inside were not. Diagrams, dry prose, and cold, precise math, a sober, clinical warning about guns and speed, stared back at them like a prediction from another century. For a moment, the room went quiet. Decades-old ink suddenly looked like an indictment. Someone had done the thinking long before the crisis. Someone had tried to warn them. Decades earlier, a man named James Puckle had already done the ugly arithmetic and put it on paper, cold and exact. He wasn't making a guess or a morale-boosting speech. He worked the trajectories, the speeds, the delays, and wrote the conclusion in plain, unforgiving language. At certain speeds, a shooter aiming at a moving aircraft will always be aiming at the wrong place. It reads like a warning from the future, precise, clinical, and suddenly terrifying, because it doesn't blame nerves or training. It points to a hard limit, a mismatch between human sight and the physics of fast flight, and it predicts the very crisis that now stares the commanders in the face. Puckle warned that once aircraft speeds climbed past about 150 miles per hour, human intuition would be effectively useless for aiming, not because gunners were cowardly or poorly trained, but because the math outpaced the mind. Bullets take time to travel, planes move yards in that time, and the brain can't reliably predict where a target will be a second from now when everything is bucking and roaring and your life is on the line. He sketched the numbers, traced the geometry, and reached a blunt conclusion. Air combat at those speeds demanded mechanical help to compute leads, a solution that sounded radical, urgent, and, at the time, inconvenient. In a quiet, exacting paper from 1924, British Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle did something few commanders ever do. He did the math and told the truth plainly. Once aircraft topped roughly 150 miles an hour, human intuition alone would fail at aerial gunnery. Without mechanical aids to calculate lead, aiming became a fantasy. It was a clear, clinical warning wrapped in numbers and equations. It should have been a call to arms. Instead, the memo slipped into the archive. No parade of engineers materialized, no doctrine changed. He was ignored, and that small oversight would, years later, be measured in burned-out bombers and the lives of young gunners. By 1943, the cost of that forgotten warning had become unmistakable. Hundreds of young men were dying while commanders scrambled for answers. Theories were dusted off, and frantic reports circled Washington and London. But the story wasn't starting from scratch. Britain had already been wrestling with the same deadly puzzle, and in the heat of earlier fights, a practical path forward was beginning to emerge. It wasn't a new gun or a miracle engine. It was a change in how men were taught to shoot, honed under fire and stubborn experimentation. In a moment, we'll drop into that crucible, the Battle of Britain, where an unlikely solution took shape. Back in 1940, amid the frantic, burning skies of the Battle of Britain, a new kind of hope lights up the horizon. Airfields are shredded, radar stations scream. Spitfires and Hurricanes stab into swarms of German bombers and fighters. The odds look grim. And then, from an unexpected corner of the RAF, a different kind of solution begins to take shape. Not a bigger gun, not a clever gadget, but a change in how men are taught to see and shoot. It's small at first. But in that crucible, something that can turn the tide is born. The scene tightens on RAF Squadron Leader Horace Darly, and what he reads makes his stomach drop. His elite Spitfire pilots are scoring a measly 6% against German bombers. 6%, not a rounding error, an extermination rate. These are pilots bred for precision, flying the best fighters in the sky, yet their bullets vanish into empty air more often than they find metal. For Darly, that number isn't abstract. It's men. That's crews, missions, lives, slipping through holes in his defenses. He feels the same cold knot other commanders felt. Training and bravery aren't enough when the brain is the weak link. Darly, who spent weekends breaking clay pigeons for sport, looked at the miserable 6% hit rates and felt something click. This isn't a hardware failure, it's a head problem. In clay shooting, you don't solve equations. You follow the bird until your body knows where to put the shot. The pilots were being taught to calculate lead like engineers, then slapped into combat where terror collapses theory into instinct, and instinct points the gun at the plane. Darly realized the fix wasn't another gizmo. It was a way to turn deflection into reflex, to teach pilots to feel the correct lead before fear could steal it. He chose to act. He makes a radical decision. He grounds his entire squadron for 3 days. No parades, no briefings, only the cockpit, the gun, and a towed banner across the sky. It's not punishment, it's surgery on instinct. Tear down the math, rebuild reflex with thousands of live rounds. 3 days that will change how they aim forever. On the ground, Darly tore up the lesson plan. No lectures, no math. For 3 days, the squadron lived in the air, dawn to dusk, engines howling, tracers lancing past a fluttering towed banner. No theory, no classroom, just the brutal loop of fly, track, fire. Hours and hours of repetition until leading stopped being a calculation and became a reflex. Darly didn't give them another lecture full of angles and equations. He gave them a single, almost scandalous order. Stop aiming. Don't think. Just track the target, feel the movement, and fire instinctively. It sounded like heresy, especially to men trained to calculate range and lead. But that was the point. He was trying to short-circuit the brain's panicked reflex to point at the plane and replace it with a practiced bodily rhythm. Follow the motion with your eyes and your hands until the correct lead lives in your muscles, not your head. It was simple, it was counterintuitive, and it would change everything. After 3 brutal days of burning through thousands of rounds, Darly's gamble pays off in a way nobody expected. The squadron's hit rate doubles, from a miserable 6% to roughly 12%, and the change is visible in real time. Tracer streams that once fell impotently behind German bombers now bite air ahead of them. Pilots who had flinched at the first burst begin to hold steady. Smiles replace that haunted look in the briefing tent. Mechanics tally fewer bullet scar repairs. The math is simple, but the lesson is seismic. Practice has turned a conscious calculation into an almost automatic, deadly reflex. Darly proved a crucial point. The subconscious mind can learn deflection far faster than the conscious mind can calculate it. Instead of forcing pilots to run through geometry in the middle of a dogfight, he turned the problem into an athletic drill. Watch, track, and fire until the body knows where to put the rounds. Repetition rewired perception. Muscle memory replaced math. Instead of calculating lead, pilots felt it. 3 days of live tracking made instinct do the work of a computer, and the results were immediate. But there was a catch. That kind of whole aircraft aiming only works because fighters can point their planes. Bomber gunners, fixed in turrets, faced a different problem. But there's a catch. What Darly taught worked because a fighter pilot can literally point the whole airplane. The pilot becomes the gun. The motion, the speed, the feeling of the machine all feed the subconscious. Track, feel, fire, and the shots land. Bomber gunners don't have that luxury. They sit in fixed turrets, pinned to a seat, wrestling with recoil, gun ports, radios, flak, and a fuselage that won't turn for them. Their world is a cramped bubble of vibration and terror, where the visual cues that make instinctive shooting possible are muddled or simply absent. So while the idea is brilliant, it doesn't scale. Bomber crews need a different kind of fix. America scrambled for answers, and they came from 2 very different directions. First, the high-tech miracle, a gun sight that didn't trust human nerves to do the math. At MIT, engineers built a miniature analog computer, gyroscopes, gearing, and clever linkages that could watch a target's motion and, in effect, predict where it would be a second from now. The gunner's job shrank to one terrifyingly simple task: keep the sight on the plane for 2 seconds and let the machine do the rest. A glowing reticle would appear, pointing not at the enemy, but at the empty air where bullets actually had to go. At MIT, Dr. Charles Stark Draper and a handful of engineers set out to take the hard math off a shaken gunner's shoulders. They worked in a cramped lab, late nights and coffee, trying to build a device that could watch a speeding enemy and tell a terrified man where to aim. The answer they chased was not a bigger gun, but a brain. A mechanical brain that could measure speed, angle, and time, and spit out a single, calm aiming point. They called it the Mark 14, a computing gun sight designed to make the impossible simple, fast, and automatic. This device is a miniature analog computer, not silicon and software, but gears, cams, and spinning gyroscopes that do the deadly math for you. The Mark 14 senses how fast the enemy is sweeping across your view and how that motion is changing, mechanically integrating speed, range, and angle into a single moving solution. Those gyros turn and feed shafts that shift the sight, translating complex physics into a simple aiming offset, a patch of empty sky to lead into. In short, it turns an impossible calculation into something your hands can follow. The gunner only has to hold the sight and trust it. In the cockpit, it felt almost miraculous and utterly simple. The gunner only had to hold his sight steady on the enemy for 2 seconds. Let the little gyros hum and do the counting. They measured speed and angular rate, and in those 2 heartbeat-long seconds, solved the physics for you. You did the tracking. The machine did the math. The result? A tiny, trustworthy aim point you could actually trust under fire. Then, after those patient seconds, a glowing reticle blooms in the sight, an almost absurd, invisible target hovering ahead of the fighter. It doesn't mark the plane. It marks the empty air where the bullets must arrive. For the gunner, it's disorienting. Your eye wants metal. The reticle demands void. Still, it gives him something concrete to hold, a little patch of sky to fix on, to squeeze at, to trust when every instinct screams otherwise. In combat, that single, stubborn point of light can turn frantic spray into deliberate, effective fire. The Mark 14 didn't just tweak the problem, it blew it open. The glowing reticle that the gunner could follow turned a deadly guessing game into a solved equation, and in trials, hit rates jumped from a paltry 5% to well over 25%, a staggering improvement that meant the difference between a few tracer hits and sustained, crippling fire. Suddenly, the math that had doomed so many crews became a practical tool in a gunner's hands. Theory met real combat, and, for the first time, the odds began to tilt toward survival. But brilliance on the bench doesn't always translate into immediacy in the field. The Mark 14 was a miracle on a bench, a miniature analog brain that could take the guesswork out of shooting. But miracles cost money. It was complex, delicate, and built from parts that factories couldn't spare overnight. Training gunners to use it took time. Installing it across hundreds of heavy bombers would take months. And the sky wouldn't wait. Bombers were still burning, crews still dying, and every delay translated into bodies. The answer on paper was brilliant. In the air, it was painfully slow. So the question hung heavy over the war. How do you bridge a gap between a perfect invention and men who need help right now? The immediate answer comes not from a lab, but from the front lines of the Pacific War. While engineers in Boston wrestled with gyros and budgets, men over the ocean were wrestling with something simpler and brutal: how to stay alive right now. There was no time for prototypes or slow production lines. Crews who flew every mission paid attention, scribbling patterns on the margins of logbooks, comparing notes between raids, testing tricks between flights. From that messy, urgent schoolroom of combat came practical, visual hacks born out of repeated failure and hard-won instinct, solutions you could hold in your hand and teach to the next terrified gunner before his next trip over the water. Staff Sergeant Bill Fleming wasn't a lab man. He was a man in a turret with soot on his face and a pencil in his pocket, and he watched. After every run, he scribbled the same things into a little notebook: where the fighters came from, how fast they seemed to cross, how far ahead his tracers landed, and, most important, where men instinctively pointed their muzzles when the sky went bright. He compared attacks side by side, night after night, hunting for a pattern in the chaos. The same instinctive mistakes, the same empty arcs of sky. Slowly, that quiet bookkeeping began to look less like habit and more like a map. Bill Fleming doesn't invent a gadget. He sits in the smoke and noise, notebooks open, watching patterns the rest of the world missed. He threads together a brutal truth into something a scared 19-year-old could remember under fire. No new radios, no gyros, no calculators. Just a rule that turns a nightmare math problem into a picture your eye can grab. It's the kind of idea that feels obvious once you see it. Clean, visual, and fast enough to use between breaths. In the middle of combat, Fleming finds a way to make aiming simple again and painfully practical. Fleming's answer was almost insultingly simple. Don't do math, measure. Use the enemy plane itself as your ruler. Lock your eye on the fighter, judge how many plane lengths it takes up in your sight. Then aim that many lengths ahead of the nose, because your bullets have to meet where the plane will be, not where it is now. The genius is that it converts a gnarly physics problem into a quick, visual rule of thumb. No gyros, no complex sights, just a concrete patch of empty sky your brain can fix on when everything else is erupting into chaos. Fast, teachable, and painfully effective. Fleming's rule is brutally simple. Use the enemy plane as your ruler. If a fighter crosses at a perfect right angle, don't aim at the nose, aim 3 full plane lengths ahead of it. Picture the zero stretched out in the sky and place your tracers into the empty air where its nose will be 3 fuselages later. No math, no instruments, just a quick, repeatable visual measure your eye can grab in a heartbeat. It gives a panicked gunner a concrete dot to aim at instead of an impossible calculation. A patch of empty sky you can trust when everything else screams otherwise. If the fighter's crossing you at about 45 degrees, don't try to do the math in your head. Use the plane as your ruler. Aim 1.5 plane lengths ahead of the nose. Squint to judge nose to tail, then add half that distance in front and put your tracers there. It's a quick visual shortcut you can hold under fire, a concrete patch of empty sky instead of an abstract calculation, and it gives your brain something real to lock onto when everything else is falling apart. What made Fleming's rule dangerous in its simplicity was also its genius. It turned a terrifying math problem into something your eyes and your gut could actually use. Instead of trying to calculate angles, speeds, and seconds in the middle of a firestorm, you look at the plane in front of you, measure its length with your own mind, and place your aim a few of those lengths ahead. It's simple, visual, and immediate. A concrete patch of empty sky replaces an abstract equation. Under pressure, the brain prefers pictures. This gave gunners something their panic could hold onto, and it was about to be shown to the men who mattered. Fleming took his sketchbook and walked it straight to Lieutenant Commander Butch Hare, a man whose name alone turned heads on any carrier deck, and laid out the method. Plane lengths as a ruler in the sky, an obvious visual cue instead of math. He spoke plain, pointed to diagrams, and watched O'Hare lean forward, trace the lines, and smile. Lieutenant Commander Butch Hare, a man already famous for thinking faster than the enemy, looks at Fleming's simple sky ruler and sees it for what it is: brutal, usable brilliance. He doesn't argue or dither. He tries it, watches gunners suddenly find a real aiming point, and feels the conviction that this will work in the panic of battle. He moves quickly, green-lighting trials, pushing the idea up the chain, using his hard-earned clout to shove it into practice. With O'Hare championing the method, Fleming's low-tech fix suddenly has the oxygen of command and a real chance to spread. With O'Hare's backing, the idea stops being a lucky field trick and becomes doctrine, christened spot shooting, or more technically, radius of action shooting. The name sounds clinical, but the method is gloriously simple. Use the enemy's own silhouette as a measuring stick. Eyeball 1, 1.5, or 3 plane lengths ahead, and put your fire into that empty patch of sky. No math, no gizmos, just a clear visual cue that the panicked brain can follow. It's a small change in language that unlocks a huge change in behavior, and now it's ready to be tested. They take Fleming's crude rule into the air and watch it work. At first, it's a field test. Carrier decks, patrol flights, quick demos between sorties. Gunners lining up, counting plane lengths, and firing where the sky must be empty. Skepticism dies fast. A few hits appear. A radio call goes out. Word skips ships and islands, from squadron to squadron. Butch O'Hare's endorsement lights a fuse. Instructors copy the chalkboard diagrams. Crews drill the new sight picture until it stops sounding strange and starts feeling reliable. Within weeks, the trick has spread like wildfire across the Pacific Fleet, changing how men aim in midair. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within days, whole squadrons that tried Fleming's spot shooting found their tracers doing something they'd rarely seen before, connecting. Hit rates didn't creep up, they jumped, more than doubling in unit after unit. A gunner who'd spent weeks firing at empty sky now watched rounds bite into a wing and felt the sick, ecstatic shock of survival. Word spread faster than orders. Crews that learned to aim at the empty air were harder to knock down. Enemy pilots began to tiptoe around well-trained formations, and commanders who'd scoffed at low-tech fixes started taking notes. Word of the Pacific trickled turned into a flood. By mid-1944, the Army Air Forces in Europe stopped treating the method as a field hack and made it doctrine. Manuals were ripped up and rewritten, training syllabi retooled, and instructors ordered to teach gunners how to aim at the empty air ahead of an enemy instead of at the plane itself. It wasn't a cosmetic change, it was institutional. Squadrons that had been luck or luckless suddenly had a common language and a common reflex to train toward. And once the rulebook said it was right, the technique moved from anecdote to standard operating procedure, setting the stage for why it worked. On paper, the change looked small, but here's why it mattered. Fleming's rule turned a hair-raising physics problem into something your eyes and reflexes could handle. Instead of trying to calculate bullet time and angular velocity, gunners anchored their aim to the plane's apparent length, a concrete patch of empty sky. That simple visual metric plugged straight into the brain's pattern recognition system, not its slow, clumsy math engine, so under fire, the body could know where to shoot without thinking. It converted abstract equations into imagery that survives panic. Still, that trick only works if a man can trust it when his instincts scream otherwise. Instead of asking men to do impossible math in the middle of a firestorm, the spot shooting trick simply hijacked perception. It turned a floating equation into something the eye could measure. The enemy's length becomes a ruler, the sky becomes a target, and the gunner's job is reduced to placing tracers into empty space where the plane will be. No more frantic mental geometry, no more instinctive, fatal tug toward the fuselage. It made aiming feel like tracking a moving object you already know, not guessing its future. It gave gunners a concrete patch of sky to trust. And yet, trusting it would prove to be its own fight. Knowing the technique was only half the battle. The harder fight happened behind the eyes. In the flash of an attack, with metal screaming past and tracers arcing into empty sky, the mind screams to do the obvious thing, point at the plane. That instinct is loud and wrong. Gunners watched their bullets fall behind the enemy and felt their confidence crumble. Seeing no immediate hit would shove them back onto the fuselage, guaranteeing more misses. Trusting an empty patch of sky, aiming at nothing, felt like madness when your crew's lives were on the line. Changing that reflex required something more than instruction. It demanded rewiring through brutal, repetitive practice. They ripped up the old curriculum and rebuilt it around one brutal fact: you can't teach instinct with lectures. Courses were stretched out. Ammunition budgets were loosened. Trainees spent day after day firing at high speed, towed targets, while instructors kept their mouths shut and the tracers did the teaching. The aim was simple and harsh: Force the correct reflex until it lives below consciousness, so when a 0 screams past your window, you don't calculate, you track and fire, automatic and unafraid. This was the final push to master the mind. They tore up the old playbook. Courses were stretched from weeks into months. Ammunition lines that had been rationed like gold were loosened. More rounds, more range time, more repetition. Training philosophy flipped. Less chalkboard calculus, more lived practice. Commanders cut budgets elsewhere. Quartermasters rerouted shipments, and instructors stopped lecturing and started drilling. It was brutal, expensive work. Deliberate repetition meant to hardwire a new reflex, so gunners could spend hours watching tracers teach their hands where to lead. Gunners, now on longer courses with larger ammo budgets, began burning through practice rounds like athletes sharpening a swing. Thousands more shots fired, not at flat paper silhouettes, but at screaming, high-speed targets towed behind boats or other planes. The air ranges became moving classrooms. Tracers carved real arcs, teaching lead and timing by blunt feedback until the reflex took over. They weren't shooting at paper anymore. These targets simulated real combat, crossing at blistering speed and unpredictable angles, forcing gunners to put the new techniques to the test. Tracer lines painted mistakes in the sky. Hits taught faster than any classroom. Track, lead, fire, adjust, repeat. Slowly, the correct reflexes burrowed deeper than panic and habit. The goal was simple and brutal. Burn the new reflex of leading so deep it no longer needed thought, so that the old, fatal instinct to point at the plane was buried under muscle memory. That meant hours in the sky, thousands of tracers, the smell of cordite and the sting of recoil becoming part of a rhythm. See the crossing? Pick a patch of empty sky, squeeze, and let the body do the rest. In practice, you learned from misses as much as hits. The instant feedback of your own tracer showed the correct path until it felt inevitable. This is what trainers chased, and why schools across the Navy and the Army began changing how they taught gunnery. At training bases like the Naval Air Gunner School in Florida, instructors ripped up the old lesson plans. No more classroom equations or dry lectures, just long, punishing days of live shooting at towed targets. Trainees fired until their eyes learned the lead. Instructors stepped back with little verbal correction, letting tracers and instinct rewrite reflexes. It was a brutal, effective reset. At places like the Naval Air Gunner School in Florida, instructors flipped the script. Instead of lectures and constant correction, they sent trainees up and again to fire at towed targets for hours with little verbal correction. No theory, just practice. The silence forced gunners to watch their own tracers, feel the timing, and slowly convert missed bursts into an automatic muscle memory lead that would save them in combat. They do something simple. Let the gunner's subconscious learn directly from the tracer light. Watching the thin lines miss, feel the split-second correction, and then watch the tracer slam into the right patch of sky. No lectures, no equations, just the raw loop of action and feedback, repeated until the body learns what the mind fights to accept, until reflex replaces reason. It's a quest to achieve mushin, no mind, a state where the body moves before the brain can second-guess it. In the gunnery context, it looks simple. Hands that follow a plane's arc, breath that steadies, eyes that track without reasoning, and fingers that squeeze the trigger because muscle memory already solved the math. It's not magic, it's brutal practice. Thousands of live runs, the sting of tracer misses, the tiny corrections that finally land a burst. Slowly, the visual system learns to predict. The nervous system rewires, and what was once a calculation becomes an instinct, a split-second habit that in combat can mean the difference between life and death. They stand apart from the frightened boys who climbed into the planes. These are the veterans, men who've flown 30 missions and come back to tell the story. You can pick them out by small things. The calm in their hands, the hollowed patience in their eyes, the way they breathe with the rhythm of the aircraft. Years of repetition have burned the math out of them and replaced it with a muscle memory so exact it feels automatic. When a fighter screams past, there's no flinch, no desperate re-aiming, only a quiet confidence born of seeing the tracers learn the sky again and again. You can see the difference like a heartbeat. The veteran's hands move without thought, their eyes lock and never waver, and the gunner becomes more like a living sight than a frightened man. Tracers stitch a precise lattice of fire into the air, arcing exactly where the enemy will be, not where he is now. Even as fear pitches through their bodies and adrenaline hammers in their ears, their motions are calm, practiced, economical. Breath, track, squeeze, over and over until the correct response is muscle memory. It looks effortless, but that ease was bought with time, rounds, and repetition, and not every man gets that price. Training the kind of muscle memory that turns a panicked hand into a calm, deadly reflex wasn't a quick fix. It demanded hours in the air, piles of ammunition, rigs, and instructors, things that cost time and money the services could scarcely spare. So, while some crews became living fortresses, many replacements were rushed out with only the barest gunnery basics, sent into the teeth of combat before instinct had a chance to be remade. The result was an uneven shield, pockets of excellence next to glaring weak spots, and a formation survival could hinge on which crew you were flying beside. The result is ugly and immediate. Bomber boxes that should be seamless become a quilt of skill. Veteran crews laying down clean, overlapping curtains of tracers. Green crews firing late, wild, or not at all. Gunners who've bled for 30 missions anchor the defense, while rookies fumble with sights and instincts, creating sudden gaps, bright, dangerous holes in what should be an impenetrable sky. From a distance, it reads like chaos. Up close, it's lethal. Those gaps invite inspection, and an enemy pilot with a cold eye can read them like a map.
Experiente und outfahrende Piloten lernen schnell die Patchwork-Defenses eines Bomberbox. Sie machen eine vorsichtige erste Pass, wachen auf Tracer-Patterns und den Rhythmus der Rückfahre, Hunting für Hesitation. Sie proben. Sie identifizieren die Crews noch am Fusage anzuvisieren und poren ihre Attacken in diese wenigsten Links. Sie scannen die Formation wie Hunde, wachen auf Tracer-Streams für Tells, ein twitchyes Spray, ein Boast. Die Gunners noch immer auf den Fusage. Diese hesitanten, unkonfidenten Shots geben ihnen alles. Einen offenen Weakpunkt, ein Bomber zu Single Out. Der Pilots mag das Target, circle back mit Kalmpräzision und setzen ihren Attack. Der Enemy doesn't gamble. Sie testen die Formation auf der ersten Pass. Eis suchen für Hesitation. Ein Single Bomber mit scared, twitchy Tracers ist alles, was sie brauchen.
Pilots swoop, peel in, and hammer that weak link, strafing its flanks, crippling its engines, forcing it out of formation. They pick at it until the bomber peels away, and the whole defensive ring threatens to fall apart. Conversely, when every turret is manned by a veteran who has burned deflection into muscle, the whole aircraft stops feeling vulnerable and starts to feel armed. Tracers arc ahead of attackers in neat, overlapping lanes. Streams of fire lace together into a moving wall. Pilots find themselves staring into a corridor of empty sky where bullets are already waiting. Enemy fighters hesitate. They skirt the edges. The math becomes instinct, and a bomber formation, once a target, becomes a living fortress of interlocking fire that few dare to breach. When trained crews lock on, their tracers don't scatter, they weave, precise, overlapping ribbons of fire that crisscross the sky. The effect is almost architectural, corridors of death and no-go zones carved in light. A lone zero doesn't want to test that lattice. Pilots weren't fast. They skitter away, choosing easier prey over a sky booby-trapped by skilled gunners. The climax isn't a single dogfight, but the thousands of tiny duels fought in a split second, when a gunner has to beat his own brain to save his crew. In the turret, it's noise and heat and tracer light. You see the zero, your training whispers, lead it, while your gut screams, point and shoot. For one long second, you have to do the unnatural. Aim at empty sky and trust a rule you can't feel. Every time a hand steadies, every time a tracer finds a wing, a crew lives. Those small, willed victories, one disciplined trigger pull after another, are what turned desperate formations into fortresses. The battle to master deflection shooting was ultimately won, not by a single superweapon, but by learning how men think and react under fire. It was hammered out in mud and gun smoke, in endless hours of towed target practice, in commanders daring their crews to trust a patch of empty sky, and in gunners forcing their hands to lead where instinct screamed to aim. Small techniques, stubborn repetition, and a radical change in training rewired reflexes. The victories were quiet: a tracer that finally hits, a formation that holds, a crew that goes home. Those human lessons, earned the hard way, would become the bedrock of modern aerial warfare.
Those hard-won lessons from the 1940s didn't vanish with the war's end. They ossified into doctrine, training, and design choices that shaped every dogfight after. The idea of predicting where a target will be, not where it appears to be, moved from classroom demonstrations and soaked-in reflexes into manuals, cockpit drills, and the very geometry of gun sights. Crews learned to trust empty sky as a target, engineers learned to automate the math, and tacticians rewired formation tactics around fields of lead. What started as survival hacks and stubborn repetition became the foundation of modern aerial warfare, an invisible architecture that would guide every future advance. Those wartime lessons didn't stay locked in classrooms. They evolved into real machines. Dr. Charles Stark Draper's bulky, ingenious computing site, an analog brain of gyros and mechanical linkages, was the stepping stone.
By the Vietnam War, that brain had married radar, and aboard F-4 Phantoms, pilots could lock, track, and let the sight do the deadly math for them. Measure motion, predict where the target would be, and give the pilot a single bright pipper to trust in the chaos of combat. It didn't eliminate skill, but it shifted the burden from frantic human calculation to engineered prediction, exactly the kind of thinking that would drive the next generation of airborne fire control. Today, the computers inside an F-22 Raptor are still doing the same brutal bit of arithmetic James Puckle described in 1924. Predicting where a fast, fleeing object will be a fraction of a second from now so you can send a missile to meet it. But now, the calculation happens in microseconds inside a chip, fusing radar returns, geometry, and physics into a single firing solution while the pilot breathes. The principle is unchanged: lead the target, but scaled up by a century of electronics. A quiet, instant answer to a problem that once cost lives and forced us to rethink how we aim at the future. The legacy is visible not just in cockpit glass, but in steel and servos. On the decks of modern warships sits the Phalanx CIWS, a squat, radar-eyed cannon that watches the sky and calculates where a threat will be long before a human can blink. It tracks, it leads, and it squeezes out thousands of rounds per minute, executing deflection shooting as an automated reflex. Where Eddie and his mates had seconds and shaky instincts, the Phalanx has milliseconds and math. It's a direct technological descendant of those wartime gun sights, impressive, coldly efficient. And yet, that power only sharpens the next, harder lesson about the human side of war. Machines could do the math, and they did it brilliantly. The Phalanx and radar gun sights turned impossible geometry into instant aiming, but that alone didn't win the war. The deeper victory was quieter and messier, men rewiring reflexes, relearning what their eyes told them, trusting a patch of empty sky more than the screaming shape in front of them. It took hours of burned ammunition, sweat, failure, and tiny corrections until leading a target became muscle memory, not a calculation. That human change, discipline replacing instinct, training overriding panic, was the real weapon. And it's the story of Eddie Kowalski and thousands like him. Eddie Kowalski's story, and the stories of the thousands who manned gun turrets and waist guns, is more than a wartime anecdote. It's proof that humans can rewire themselves under the harshest pressure. They were terrified, tired, and wildly outmatched on paper. Yet through brutal repetition, strange tricks, and stubborn faith, they taught their bodies to do what their instincts would not: aim at empty air and hit a moving death machine. It was painful work, shattered nerves, endless drills, and the bitter cost of lessons learned in combat. But out of that pain came a new kind of skill, one that reshaped aerial warfare and the men who flew it. They were ordinary men forced to do something extraordinary, unlearn a lifetime of instinct. Eddie and his comrades, kids from small towns and factory floors, had been trained to point and fire, not to aim at nothing. The reflexes that served them on the street or the ball field suddenly worked against them in the sky. Each attack became a mental fight, terror pulling their sights back while training shouted, "Lead forward." So they drilled. Hours of live fire, endless towed targets, thousands of tracers teaching new habits until muscle memory flipped. Gradually the panic eased and a fragile trust grew, a trust in empty air, in a truth they couldn't see. It sounds simple on paper, but in the moment it was a small, violent act of will. The body wanted to stare at the plane, to drive the sights into metal and smoke, but survival demanded the opposite. Under shrapnel and roar and the blind surge of adrenaline, these men had to pause that first reflex, count plane lengths in their head, pick a patch of empty sky, and trust that the bullets would meet the enemy there a heartbeat later. They had to believe in invisible geometry, lead, time, distance, more than their own eyes. It was ugly, counterintuitive work. It was the difference between surviving and not. They learned to aim at nothing, to point their guns at a patch of empty sky and trust the math, the training, the tiny glowing reticle, or the simple plane length rule they'd burned into muscle memory. It sounds absurd until you're the man watching a fighter flash by and every reflex screams to follow the fuselage. The only way to save your crew is to fix your sight where the plane will be, not where it is. So, under fire, in endless repetition, instinct was chipped away, and a stranger, calmer reflex took over. Tracers that once fell behind now braided into a deadly wall. It wasn't a single miracle weapon that turned the tide so much as ordinary men willing to reprogram themselves, to trust a hole in the sky, and in doing so, to hit everything that mattered. Their struggle proves that we are not slaves to our first impulses or our flawed perceptions. Under fire, ordinary men taught themselves to distrust the gut and trust a counterintuitive rhythm, aiming at empty sky to make a deadly reality. They traded reflex for rehearsal, panic for practiced motion. It was a slow, brutal education. Thousands of rounds, sweat, and the willingness to adopt a strange new truth even as planes burned around them. By forcing their bodies to do what their brains resisted, they carved a fragile advantage that saved crews, reshaped training, and changed how wars above our heads would be fought. In the end, it wasn't new guns or clever gadgets that won those duels so often. It was stubborn human work. With courage, relentless training, and a desperate will to survive, crews forced their reflexes to match the cold math of the sky. They fired until their hands remembered the empty patch of air where a plane would be, until tracers became the only language they trusted. They rewired fear into habit, turned calculation into muscle memory, and learned to aim at nothing so they could hit everything. It was brutal, it was simple, and it saved lives. That hard-won lesson, forged in the frozen skies over Europe and the warm waters of the Pacific, is timeless. It traveled from cramped turrets and shaken crews into doctrine and devices. It taught commanders to respect human limits and engineers to build machines that compensate for them. More than tactics, it became a lesson about training the mind, how repetition, trust, and brutal honesty with failure turn instinct into weapon. The men who relearned how to see saved comrades and changed warfare.
And that change didn't stop at metal and math. It reached into how we accept uncomfortable truths about ourselves, a lesson that still hums under every modern cockpit and defensive system. It represents a victory not just over an external enemy, but over the enemy within our own minds. It's the moment when training, repetition, and sheer stubbornness beat back instinct, when men taught themselves to aim at emptiness because emptiness was the only place bullets would meet a moving target. That quiet, stubborn reprogramming saved lives. It turned panic into practiced reflex, fear into disciplined muscle memory. The lesson is simple and brutal. Sometimes survival means unlearning what feels right. That lesson didn't die with the war. It lives on, woven into our machines and our habits, and now it asks us to look inward. Eddie's story isn't just a WW2 footnote, it's a mirror held up to us. We still act on instincts shaped for a different world. Snap reactions, the urge to point at the obvious, the conviction that guts trump complexity. Today, those instincts steer decisions about everything from tech and politics to personal safety and finance, and often they lead us to fire at the visible target while the real problem sails by. The remedy back then was the same we need now. Slow the reflex, translate complexity into simple cues, train until the right response becomes automatic, and when machines can help, let them. So ask yourself, what are you aiming at?